Welcome back to the Last Days Book Club as we continue our reading of The Man Who Couldn't Be Killed, the true and unforgettable story of faith and miraculous deliverance in communist China at the height of the Cultural Revolution, written by Stanley Maxwell. In our last reading, we covered chapters 18 and 19, where a new supervisor takes over the camp and punishes Mr. Wang for refusing to work on Sabbath by allowing the members of his work unit to beat him mercilessly. Mr. Wang still refused to work, and the beating continued weekly for 6 months, but he never complied, and eventually they left him alone, and he did not work on Sabbaths. After this, Mr. Wang worked with and converted the camp's inmate doctor during a drought, and they became friends, with the doctor smuggling him extra rations when he was returned to working in the field. One day, the new supervisor called out Mr. Wang in front of all the prisoners and promised to move him from Team 9 to an easier work unit, Team 5, if he would renounce his God. Of course, Mr. Wang could not comply. As punishment, he was beaten by 50 of the strongest prisoners. The beating was so severe that the doctor, who was among the inmates witnessing the punishment, yelled out for them to stop, for fear they might kill him. For this, the doctor was also beaten, although not as severely as Mr. Wang, and the beating of Mr. Wang continued with more vigor than before. Nonetheless, Mr. Wang refused to renounce his God and his friend Jesus. The doctor was no longer allowed to practice medicine treating the inmates and was transferred to another prison camp, and Mr. Wang never saw him again. We continue our reading today with chapter 20, entitled An Angel Untied the Knot, and chapter 21, entitled Say the 10 Regulations. We begin with chapter 20, An Angel Untied the Knot. One day, during the coldest part of the winter in 1961, a jailer burst into the prison hospital niche where Mr. Wang was working. "Criminal Wang, come with me." Mr. Wang wondered, will I be assigned to a new post, or am I in for more punishment? He followed the jailer into a larger niche. Minutes later, Li Man Kai was escorted in. "Criminal Wang," the jailer scolded, "we know you have been explaining superstitious beliefs." So Li Man Kai was a Judas too, hoping to receive merit or a reduced prison term. "Criminal Li gave us this." The jailer handed Mr. Wang the toilet paper, evidence of betrayal. "You gave this to Criminal Li, didn't you?" "Yes. I wrote out scriptural text for him. This is one of the 10 regulations." "Stop telling bourgeois liberalistic stories about the real God," the jailer yelled. "Teach Chairman Mao's sayings, not Jesus' fables." Mr. Wang looked straight into the jailer's eyes. Lonely prisoners need to know the word of Jesus. The jailer glared back. "You in prison for your superstitious activities." Angrily, he bound Mr. Wang and ordered Li Man Kai to beat him. As inmate Li hit him, the jailer sneered. "We have rules about religion. You must obey, Criminal Wang." I'm sorry your rules go against the laws of Jesus, my friend, who is the Son of the real God. Mr. Wang spoke solemnly. I'll follow Peter's example when the Jewish Sanhedrin told him to stop talking about Jesus. Peter chose to obey God's laws rather than people's. Suddenly, Li Man Kai's face lighted up. Eagerly, he stepped up to the jailer, saying conspiratorially, "Other people tied criminal Wang, but he could still move. If I bind somebody, he can't move unless I release him. I have a special knot," he bragged, pressing for favor. "I call it my Li Man Kai knot. No one can untie it but me. Let me bind criminal Wang with it. I promise you won't be disappointed." An impish grin broke across the jailer's face, indicating he approved of the plan to tie up the troublesome Mr. Wang. Anything to persuade him to change. "Do as you like, criminal Li. What's your plan?" "Take him out to the cold and tie him to a post," inmate Li urged. When the jailer consented, Mr. Li doffed a hat and coat and fashioned his tightest knot around Mr. Wang's wrists. The pressure stopped the circulation, turning Mr. Wang's fingers slightly blue. Several inmates grabbed Mr. Wang roughly and followed Li Man Kai, who had a coil of rope draped over his shoulder. The group dragged Mr. Wang outside the burrow. The cold air took Mr. Wang's breath away. A light snow was falling. Mr. Wang was glad that he had worn heavier clothes that day. When they reached the outer perimeter of the prison grounds, they dropped Mr. Wang near a post. A stiff, cold wind was blowing as Li Man Kai strapped Mr. Wang to the post. "I, Li Man Kai, tied you up today with my tightest knots," he scoffed. "Tomorrow, we'll see if your God can save you. You not only have my Li Man Kai knot to bind you, but the Liberation Army will watch you all night. You must remain motionless. If you so much as move a muscle, a soldier will shoot you immediately." Li Man Kai obviously enjoyed his moment of power. One soldier remained to guard Mr. Wang. Singhai's strong north wind and swirling snow dropped the temperature to 38 degrees below Celsius. Their breath crackled as it froze before their faces. Eventually, the shivering soldier could endure the cold no longer and walked toward the guardhouse. Mr. Wang guessed the soldier had reasoned that they needn't both perish. He watched the soldier struggle laboriously against the wind, staggering back towards warmth and safety. By midnight, Mr. Wang had difficulty breathing the frigid air. His thick clothes could keep him warm through the night when he slept in the cave. But outside, in the swift breeze, he felt the cold set in, and he knew he'd soon be frostbitten and freeze to death. He turned to Jesus. "My friend, I know you are the real God. I know that you were crucified for me so I could be saved. I'm willing to be a martyr for you if it's your will. But I don't think now is the right time. I'd rather die for you when I can give you more glory." Suddenly, he felt a presence behind him. The next thing he knew, the knots were loose. Mr. Wang wriggled his way out of the rope. He was free. Immediately, he tended to business relieving his bladder. Then he exercised to stay warm. All through the long night, Mr. Wang jumped up and down and ran circles around the post. Sometimes he even ventured a few yards away from the post. And all through the night, he prayed. He prayed that Jesus would keep the guards from seeing him untied. And he prayed that Jesus would keep him strong to endure whatever persecution might lie in the future. Sometimes, when he felt warm enough to stand the cold for a while, Mr. Wang sat against the post in the same position the guard had left him, so that in case one of the guards happened to see him, it would look like he was still tied up. But as soon as the cold penetrated his body again, he stood up to exercise. The hours seemed to drag by as Mr. Wang alternated between exercising and resting against the post. Finally, he saw the sky begin to lighten in the east, and he knew that his torture was nearing its end. Then, as the sun began to rise, he realized that he had another problem. When the guards returned and found him loose, they would accuse someone in the camp of coming to his aid, and they might hurt or kill his supposed benefactor. Furthermore, the accused would very likely be a prisoner who had enjoyed talking about his friend Jesus. He didn't wish to cause grief to those who showed an interest in the real God. So he sat down against the post and retied his ankles. But tying his wrists behind his back posed a problem. He needed an extra pair of hands. There seemed no human solution. He prayed again. Lord, you sent my guardian angel to untie me. Please send him back to tie me up again. Immediately, he felt the ropes tighten around his hands. He was held fast to the post. A few moments later, he heard a guard approaching. The guard came around in front of Mr. Wang, leaned over, and looked in his face. Mr. Wang smiled. "Good morning," he said. The guard gasped, and his face turned white. "You're alive?" he exclaimed. "This can't be. You're supposed to be frozen to death." He went around to the other side of the post and felt Mr. Wang's hands. "Your hands are warm," he exclaimed. "They're supposed to be blocks of ice." The guard tried untying Mr. Wang's hands, but he had trouble with the knot. So he came around in front and untied his feet first. In just a few seconds, Mr. Wang's feet were free. The guard then returned to the rope around Mr. Wang's hands, but the knot was so tight that he could not untie it. Half an hour later, Mr. Wang finally felt the rope fall from his wrists. He couldn't help thinking that his guardian angel either didn't know his own strength or he had a delightful sense of humor. The guard said nothing as they walked back toward the main part of the compound, and Mr. Wang sensed that he had a sense of awe, almost of reverence. The guard led Mr. Wang up to a fire, around which a group of guards sat warming themselves. Everyone started talking at once the moment they saw Mr. Wang. They asked the guard why his prisoner was not frozen to death, and they asked Mr. Wang how he had survived the night. Mr. Wang's guard found a place for him near the fire where he could enjoy the most heat and breathe in the least smoke. Mr. Wang could scarcely remember when he had been treated so kindly by a guard. As he warmed his hands and feet near the fire, Mr. Wang sent a prayer toward heaven. Thank you, God, for allowing me to experience this miracle. Your angel untied Li Man Kai's invincible knot. The guards didn't expect me to survive the night. That precious miracle has given me the confidence to believe you will protect me and assist me through any difficulty. As the sun rose, so did the prisoners. Mr. Wang watched them drag themselves out of the cave into the bitter cold. They gravitated toward the warmth of the campfire. Not certain whether they could trust their eyes, the prisoners formed a circle around Mr. Wang and stared at him without a word. One touched Mr. Wang's wrists to be certain he wasn't an apparition. Mr. Wang knew. They wondered how he had survived a night in the cold. He thanked God, feeling certain that soon they would ask him about his friend, the real God, who he felt had indeed saved him. Some tired of steering and returned to their niches. Li Man Kai, who had bragged so loudly about his famous knot, was conspicuously silent. As they talked among themselves, Mr. Wang heard them refer to him as the man who couldn't be killed. For quite some time, both guards and prisoners left him alone until new guards were assigned to the hard labor camp. The end of chapter 20. Chapter 21. Say the 10 regulations. Round and round, Mr. Wang and Choi Gong-ding went, turning a large grindstone that crushed highland barley. More monotonous than strenuous, the work at the mill afforded an opportunity for Mr. Wang to talk one-on-one with prisoners about his friend Jesus and the 10 regulations. Remembering his success with Dr. Lai, he hoped he could witness to inmate Choi. As they toiled, Choi Gong-ding seemed more thoughtful than usual. What was going on in his mind? Mr. Wang wondered. Eventually, Mr. Choi revealed his concern. My mother is a Christian, old Wang. I'd like to learn more about the Bible and become a Christian like you. Overjoyed, Mr. Wang replied. Do you know the 10 regulations? What are they? Would you like to hear a story? I love stories. As the two continued to rotate the millstone, Mr. Wang told how Moses hiked up Mount Sinai to receive the stone tablets on which the real God had carved the 10 regulations with his own finger. When Moses came down and saw the people dancing around a golden idol shaped like a calf, he had, in righteous indignation, lifted the tablets over his head and cast them down, shattering them into tiny pieces. Why did Moses break a gift from God? Inmate Choi asked. Mr. Wang smiled. All of us have rebelled against those regulations, just as those people at the foot of Mount Sinai did. When Moses threw down the stones, breaking them into little bits, it meant that God's people had broken their promise to obey the regulations of the real God. Mr. Wang emptied the ground barley and reloaded the mill. Tempted to supplement his diet with a handful of the grain, he remembered the guard's warning that any offender taking extra grain will be shot. The rule seemed ridiculous, for he felt worthy of the food as a laborer. Though he might be able to eat some extra barley unnoticed by a guard, he wanted to be an example to his partner. Feeling the ache in his stomach, he put the thought from his mind and gripped the rod. As they resumed circling the millstone, Mr. Wang said, "One of these 10 regulations explains why I won't work on Sabbath." Delighted that a fellow inmate seemed interested, he prayed silently that Choi Gongding would discern truth and understand it and persevere. What are the 10 regulations? Choi Gongding had asked what Mr. Wang longed to hear. He recited them from memory and asked inmate Choi to repeat them after him. Mr. Choi happily complied until he too could say all 10 by heart. On future occasions, the two men continued studying the Old and New Testaments. Mr. Wang supplied additional verses to memorize until Mr. Choi understood Christianity. "Old Wang," inmate Choi said one day as they walked around the grindstone, "I've decided I want Jesus for my friend. As his friend, I don't want to do anything to displease him. So I'm asking him to help me refrain from breaking his 10 regulations. Do you think he'll do that for me?" Hearing those words, Mr. Wang felt that his time in prison was doubly well spent. First, the doctor had accepted Christ, and now a Christian mother's dreams had come true. Smiling with inner joy, he assured Choi Gongding, "Heaven enjoys double happiness today. I'm sure your friend Jesus will happily help you, but you must make an effort too." Then he cautioned, "Old Choi, don't forget, Jesus never promised that following him would be easy. From now on, you'll have to take up your sword and fight." "You've taught me already, Old Wang," Mr. Choi replied as he poured Highland barley into the millstone. "I've weighed everything carefully." Later, in 1962, when Mr. Wang and 300 other prisoners lined up in the cave for morning roll call and exercises, a guard grabbed one of the prisoners and pushed him to the front beside the supervisor. Mr. Wang's heart sank as he recognized his friend, Choi Gongding. Had he too become a Judas? Suddenly, someone jerked Mr. Wang from behind and roughly escorted him to the front beside inmate Choi. The 300 pale, puffy-faced prisoners stared blankly at them. Guards called up 2 of the heftier inmates and directed them to stand on either side of Mr. Wang and Mr. Choi. Immediately, these prisoners shoved Wang's and Choi's heads downward and held them. "Criminal Wang," the supervisor barked, "did you think you could do anything without us knowing?" "No." "Do you think you could talk without us overhearing?" Mr. Wang made no reply. "Criminal Choi," the big prisoner at Choi's side yanked his hair. "Confess your conversation with Criminal Wang." "He taught me the 10 regulations," inmate Choi mumbled. "Speak up, Criminal Choi." The hefty inmate, holding Mr. Choi's head, looked in the direction of the guards, and seeing a slight smile of approval on the guard's face, smacked the back of his head. "Tell everybody what he told you." Mr. Wang felt deeply pained to see his friend suffer, knowing he didn't want to confess? Would the torture be too much for him to endure? As he watched inmate Choi's torment, he prayed that his friend wouldn't weaken. After a brief, agonizing pause, Choi Gonding announced in a loud voice, "Criminal Wong told me about an old man with a long white beard named Moses, who climbed up a mountain to talk to the real God. When Moses met the real God, he received a gift of 2 tablets of stone. With his own finger, the real God had written unto them his 10 regulations that," interrupting, the new supervisor shouted, "Criminal Wong, you've been telling silly Bible stories to Criminal Choi. You forced him to memorize superstitious nonsense. You're breaking the prison rules again. Criminal Choi, you are our witness. Repeat what he told you." The hefty inmate beside inmate Choi yanked his head upward. Mr. Wong saw fear in his friend's face, and pitying him, prayed for him again and again. But Mr. Choi's eyes glazed over as he spoke in a staccato. "I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself a carved image, any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth." Mr. Wong was amazed that the supervisor would allow Choi to continue reciting the 10 regulations, but the officer made no move to silence him. Mr. Wong listened, and his friend recited all 10 of the regulations without a single mistake. God had provided an opportunity for the guards and the prisoners to hear every one of them. Mr. Wong's heart sang, in spite of the pain in his scalp from the pressure the prisoner beside him was putting on his hair. All the prisoners listened silently to Mr. Choi's recitation. An ear, solemn like a monastery, hung over the cave. The supervisor shattered the silence, shouting, "Criminal Choi has presented evidence before you all by chanting superstitious dogma." Turning, he sneered, "Criminal Wong, we asked him to chant that feudalistic nonsense so the prisoners could know your crime." But Mr. Wong heard the prisoners murmuring amongst themselves, "I'm a thief. I broke the 7th regulation. That's why I'm here." Another said, "I killed a man. I broke the 6th regulation. That's why I'm here." The supervisor's plan had backfired. Rather than feeling embarrassed or defeated, Mr. Wong felt victorious. He never would have guessed that teaching Mr. Choi would result in this wholesale teaching of the 10 regulations to all the prisoners at the instigation of his jailers. Truly, his real God had often used wicked people to spread his truth. Silently, he thanked his friend Jesus for this unexpected opportunity to witness. Since his crime had been exposed, would further punishment follow? Mr. Wong wondered. As he worked with his unit that day, he felt pity for inmate Choi, and he felt apprehension that the government would soon retaliate. That night, as the prisoners ate in the cave, a guard approached Mr. Wong, pulled out a pair of handcuffs, and snapped them onto his wrist. In a loud voice, he announced, "These handcuffs are your punishment for teaching counter-revolutionary ideas to criminal Choi and for breaking prison regulations. Every night, we'll handcuff you until you comply." Before he left, The guard added. You're lucky, criminal Wang, that you work hard. Otherwise we'd handcuff you all day long. The handcuffs were a nuisance, making it difficult to sleep. But Mr. Wang felt that they were a small price to pay for 300 prisoners to hear the 10 regulations. The end of chapter 21 of The Man Who Couldn't Be Killed.